Hey, welcome back everyone to Cafe Oleh. My name is Jay. I'm a volunteer with Nefesh B'Nefesh. I myself made Aliyah with Nefesh B'Nefesh 15 and a half years ago. And here at Cafe Oleh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed. Whether that's reading your utility bills and how to pay them, going to the grocery store and reading nutrition labels, keeping up with the news, getting into arguments with people, flirting with people, going out, whatever it may be, everyday life here in Israel, how to do it in modern Hebrew. As always, we welcome your suggestions for topics to go over. We always not only encourage you to submit your suggestions to us, but we really want to make this as user focused as possible. So please send in any topics that you'd like us to cover that we haven't already. As always, you can see all of our previous lessons on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com, type in Cafe Oleh, or go to Nefesh B'Nefesh's page, and you'll be able to see all our previous episodes that are saved in the playlist. You can click subscribe on the Nefesh B'Nefesh channel, and you'll get updates when this lesson goes up in the next few days, as well as any future lessons as well. And you can go back and watch all of these at your leisure. Take your time, go back and review, screenshot the vocabulary, whatever you would like. So today, last week we went over everything to get ready for Purim, which is later this week. Today we're going to go over a topic that has been submitted by a number of you that I'm excited to go over, and I'm excited in that I love grammar, and I love how Hebrew grammar works because it's incredibly logical once you crack the code. And I think this is an important lesson because I understand more and more hearing from people who are going through an ulpan, regardless if it's a good ulpan, less ulpan, whatever it may be, that this specific lesson is rarely taught. It used to be taught. It was considered way too formal, way too complicated, and it hasn't, for the sake of keeping things relevant. And what we're talking about today is specifically verbs, right? Verbs and verb conjugation, frankly, scares a lot of Hebrew learners. All the different things you have to keep in mind, all the different things. Wait, I thought it's supposed to conjugate like this, but it doesn't conjugate like that. But wait, why is this vowel like this and not vowel like that? What we're going to do today is we're basically going to crack the code of what you need to take into account when you're using a verb in Hebrew, any verb of any kind. We're going to start with a checklist that's actually going to be your takeaway from this lesson. You're going to have 4 points that you always need to keep in mind when using a verb. And we're going to revisit a website. It's probably one of the best Hebrew language resources I've seen in a long time. The website version is completely free. They do have an app, which has a one-time payment of 36 shekel. That's your call if you want to use it. We're going to go through this website together because it is an amazing resource. It is a powerful website. It will help everything you need to know about verbs whatsoever. And let's start from there. So as I see a whole bunch of people writing in the chat and the Q&A, just as a friendly reminder, those of you who are on the call, if you have a question about this specific lesson that we're going to do, please write it in the Q&A section. You'll see that in the Zoom bar, excuse me, where it says Q&A. If you have questions or comments or requests of any kind, please put that in the chat. There's currently 147 of you on this call, which is amazing. Please keep that in mind. There's only one of me and quite a lot of you. And special props, as we say, in my generation to all of you who remembered that the time changed in the United States and not yet here in Israel. So the United States has already gone on daylight saving time. Israel has yet to. It will be at the end of the month, along with most of continental Europe. So spring forward has yet to happen here. So those of you who remembered, we still started at 8 p.m. Israel time, which has now changed for some of you. Thank you for joining. So I want to start, before I share the screen, by looking at a regular print dictionary. And this is my tried and tested from middle and high school. It's going to be backwards in the screen, but that's okay. I'll still read it to you. In English, it's called Multi-Dictionary. In Hebrew, it's called Rav Milon, which is the literal translation of it. It's by Edna Loudon and Leora Weinbach. If you can see that up here. This is a great dictionary. I've referenced it multiple times before because for every definition, every word entry in here, rather, it gives you the root of it. It gives you a sample sentence, gives you how to pronounce it. It gives you so many resources. And in the back, it has words by category. It has infinitive verbs. And then it has what most dictionaries have, which is a verb conjugation table. Okay, if you've never seen this before, Hebrew grammar, specifically with verbs, conjugate in very specific ways. We're going to go through the general of it. We're not going through every single one of these. This gives you all the different forms based on what binyan it is, and we'll talk about what a binyan is. It goes through if a letter in the shoresh, those three letters that create a create the basis of all words, have letters that often influence how the verb is conjugated or pronounced, all sorts of different things like that. It is just a great resource. But anyways, why I bring up this verb conjugation table, this is standard in most dictionaries, right? You're going to see this in the back of most dictionaries, whether you have 501 Hebrew verbs or this or any of the other ones, they're going to have this on here. Okay, so I say this first off because printed dictionaries still have value. But I also say this because when we go through the website that I'm going to share with you in a little bit, you're going to see why things have changed since that table. That table is still very valuable, but there's an even better resource in many ways out there. And also doesn't mean that you have to lug around this guy or the 501 Hebrew verbs, which is even thicker when you're using Hebrew on a regular basis. So let's start sharing my screen. First, let me just make sure it's ready. Just 1 second. Aha. Okay, let me open that up. Share screen. All right, so like I said, we're going to start with the checklist. And this checklist is as much going to guide us through this lesson as it is a checklist for you to take away after this class. When you are using verbs in modern Hebrew, just like verbs in most languages, you need to keep in consideration a couple different things. The subject and the object, all sorts of different things. But in Hebrew, we have very specific guidelines, and there's 4 of them. Or at least as I would say, there are 4 important things that whenever you're going to use a verb, whenever you're going to conjugate a verb, whenever you're talking or doing something and then describing it as an action, you're going to need to know these 4 things. So we're going to go through these together. The first one is gender. We've talked about this multiple times. Everything in Hebrew is gendered, right? Everything is either masculine or feminine. Doesn't mean the quality of that is or isn't. It just means everything is, not just nouns and adjectives, but yes, verbs. So when you are conjugating a verb, you have to conjugate it based on the to whom is referring or to what is referring the action. If I'm, for example, speaking, ani medaber, or ani medaber, depending on how you say the letter resh, which means I am speaking, I am talking. But if a woman is speaking, isha medaberet, right? The woman is speaking, is talking, right? So immediately, even though we're using the exact same sentence and it's the exact same time, it's present tense, I have to change the conjugation of that verb based on the gender of, in this case, the subject, right? I speak, ani medaber, the woman speaks, Aisha medaberet. Okay, so keeping gender in mind is going to be always important when you're conjugating. You can't leave that out. The second one is tense. Tense is what we're going to go over a little bit more in detail in a minute. Tense is everything that it sounds like, present, past, future, but also a few other tenses. Those of you who know other languages than English, you know this very well. There are some languages that have 12, 14, 16 tenses out there. Thankfully, blessedly, Hebrew only has I think it's about 6 or 7 I have listed here, but it's not nearly as comprehensive as other languages. Those of you, for example, who've studied Spanish or French, you know these. Those of you who have mercifully studied Latin or German or Russian, you know there are many more available out there. Hebrew is very merciful in how few there are. The third one we've talked about before. We're not going to go over as much like we talked about with gender. Gender we talked about, right? Male and female, you have to conjugate accordingly. Tense, we're going to go through in a little bit. Active and passive, we've talked about this before. We're going to get into it a little bit more when we go through tenses and number 4 here. But this is really important, again, to emphasize, especially to my fellow native English speakers. In Hebrew, active and passive is very important, whether you're speaking in the active or you're speaking in passive. It is not as simple as simply using the verb to be and then using the past participle. If that's too grammatical for you, that's the difference between I wrote versus the book was written. Okay, the book was written is passive. And in English, for many years, we've often been taught that is bad English, quote unquote, bad English. It's not great, not good English. We should always start an active sentence with the subject at the beginning. Hebrew doesn't work like that. We've talked about this many times before. Hebrew actually likes passive. It's not that you're always going to be able to use it, but when it's an option, Hebrew considers that higher level of Hebrew. It's the same, by the way, in all Semitic languages. Arabic is definitely the same. Hebrew loves passive, and we're going to go through passive. It's not as complicated as it may seem to you. And the fourth one is a unique aspect to Semitic languages, Hebrew definitely included, which in Hebrew we call binyan or binyanim. Binyan is simply a structure or a building. And it's the building mechanism that we use to create verbs, which makes, again, Hebrew grammar incredibly logical. And I can understand why my fellow native English speakers get all flustered about binyanim, because it shows how illogical English often is. This makes a lot of sense once you crack the code. And we're going to go a little bit into cracking the code a little bit more with the specific one, number 4, in a bit. But just know this is your checklist. So if you want to write this down, if you want to take a screenshot, if you want to come back when this is up on YouTube in the next few days, these are your 4 points that whenever you're using a verb in Hebrew, you need to keep in mind when you're conjugating a verb. Gender, tense, is it active or passive, and binyan. Okay, so let's start unpacking these together. Let's start with tense. Okay, gender is pretty straightforward. Tense. So tense, like I said, is what we would normally think of: past tense, present tense, future tense. There's more to it than that. We're going to get into it here. First off, we're going to start with the infinitive. Infinitive, we've talked about a lot, is always going to be your friend, especially if you're struggling with conjugating verbs and learning how to, because the infinitive is exactly what it means. It's infinitive. It has not been conditioned by time or space. It's the equivalent of, as you see here, to write. Okay, to write. It's to do, to be, to act, to sleep, to sing, whatever it may be. It hasn't been specified in a verb. It hasn't been specified by gender or by tense or by active or passive or by binyan. It's the infinitive. It's simple, lichtov. And we've talked about this before. How to talk about, for example, if you didn't want to conjugate. So to say something like, Efshar lichtov li hayom bevakasha. Could you write to me today, please? Right? Very simple, and you don't have to conjugate the verb. It's really easy when you don't, when you're particularly hung up on conjugating. Infinitive is going to be your friend. Infinitive, this dictionary in particular has a list of infinitives in the back, so you can look them up. However, in a standard dictionary, that is not the way you're going to look up a verb. The way you're going to look up a verb in a regular dictionary is by the past tense third person singular. So he wrote, okay? That's what you're going to look like. You're going to look for. It's the basic form of that, and that's going to give you the full conjugation of that verb and all sorts of other things to it. But just know the infinitive is an important one. We use it a lot in Hebrew, just like you do in English. You just don't know it because in English, it's separated into two words, right? To write. In Hebrew, it's one word, lichtov. We use this a lot. You use it a lot in English too. Past tense. Past tense is as simple as that. I wrote. Okay. In Hebrew, the past tense is done or it's nearing completion. It's not an ongoing event, right? It's in the past, means it's in the past. Ani katavti, I wrote. Okay. And then it gets conjugated again. Again, I'm going to show you a great conjugation table online. Dictionaries have them. I'm not going to go through all of those here. That's not the point of this lesson. The point is to think above and beyond how you're normally taught about verbs in Hebrew. Present tense. Present tense in Hebrew is interesting because ani kotev, as you see here in row 4, ani kotev is both I write and I am writing. Okay, that's a very important distinction in Hebrew. It can mean both. And that may sound like a nuanced point for some of you, but sometimes it does make a difference. The difference between I write and I am writing, right? I write to the newspaper every week versus I am writing to the newspaper every week. They're both in the present tense, just one happens to be happening in this moment, and one happens to be an ongoing event. There is subtlety in that, but it's an important distinction that in other languages, you would have a completely different conjugation for. In Hebrew, they're both the same. I write and I am writing are the exact same thing in Hebrew, ani kotev. Future, ani echtov, I will write. Okay, same thing. I will write. It doesn't say when that's going to start. The rest of the sentence will give more context to that. But just know that's exactly translates as you think. I will write. Now, what's important to point out here and in both the past and the future is that the conjugations of them leave little to the imagination. What do I mean by that? Ani katavti and ani echtov can only mean I wrote, ani katavti, and I will write echtov. They can't be confused for any other person or tense or anything like that, or singular or plural, anything like that. Whereas in the present tense, ani kotev, if I just wrote kotev without the pronoun ani, I wouldn't know who this is referring to. Ani just kotev could also be singular you, singular second person masculine, you write, ata kotev, or it could be he writes, hu kotev, right? Third person singular. So it's very important in the present tense to have that pronoun, to have that subject at the beginning before a verb, whereas in the past and the future, you can get away with not writing ani each time. If I wrote katavti, it's 100% clear who is writing. It's me, ani katavti. Okay, that conjugation, that specific conjugation that we have in the past and the future makes it clear who's writing in this specific case. So you don't have to use the pronoun each time. Okay. Let's move on to the imperative. The imperative we've talked about before is the command form. Okay. Again, some of these words you've probably heard if you've ever learned another language, or it's giving you bad flashbacks of learning some Romance language in high school that you've never used ever since. But they're important when learning other languages because English is wonderful in many ways. And with all due respect to it, it's a little sloppy and lazy in other ways. You don't learn these terms until it's too late, and then you get really flustered. Imperative is the term that's normally used when you're learning a language. Imperative simply means a command. Think an action followed by an exclamation point. In this case, write, exclamation point. To say write to singular male would be ktov, Or in everyday language, we would normally say tichtov. Remember, we've talked about this before, that the command form in Hebrew can either be the imperative form, which is this specific conjugation here, ktov, or more than often, we'll use the future tense, second person. So you will write, or you shall write. If that shall makes it sound more commanding, then by all means translate it as such. So ktov is the imperative. Tichtov is also the command form. The gerund. Gerund is really important in Hebrew. We've talked about this quite a lot. The gerund is also known as the verbal noun. It's the act of doing something. So in this case, the act of writing, which means writing, is ktiva. Okay? So ktiva, the gerund of lichtov. The past participle. Past participle is also something we love in Hebrew. We've talked about participles before, that they can be nouns, they can be adjectives, and they can also be verbs. Hasefer katuv. The book is written. Okay, so the book is written is a verb and it's an adjective and it's all sorts of different things. Hasfarim haktuvim, the written books, right? It's an adjective and then altogether it's also a noun. Katuv is a also a powerful form, this past participle. And again, the resource I'm going to show you online helps you with this past participle, but it's an important thing to understand. In this case, it means written. Think the words for patuach, meaning open, or sagul, meaning closed, right? We have other words to use that in Hebrew, like the passive form, but we also like this past participle quite a lot, right? So far, we've gone through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tenses in Hebrew that have their own conjugation, right? Lichtov for infinitive, katavti, past, ani kotev, present, and so forth. Each of these in the green, and that's why they're in green, have their own unique conjugation, right? So when you look in a dictionary or when you look at our website in a little bit, you will have to look for this very specific conjugation of that verb in that specific tense if you want to use it. So if you want to say any of these tenses, use any of these tenses, that's what you're going to need to look for. What you're not going to find in a dictionary, and this is really important, if you've zoned out, this is an important part to listen in. What the dictionary is not going to tell you are 2 other tenses that we use all the time, not just in English, but in other languages, that don't have their own conjugation. Instead, they have to use a helper verb to make them. Okay, and that is rows 9 and 10, the conditional and the subjunctive. Again, don't get bogged down by the grammatical words that I'm using here. I love grammar. You can look up these words on your own. I'll explain them to you. Conditional. Conditional is simply put would followed by a verb. I would do something, but I would do this and hope that you do that, right? It's on condition of something else happening that I will do a certain task or perform a certain action. That's all it means. Conditional, condition. Just think of that, okay? Excuse me. So, הייתי כותב את המתווה אם תאשר את מטרת הפרויקט. I tried to think of something office-like and white collar here. It's just what happened to come in my mind thinking of a sample sentence here. I would write the outline if you would confirm the purpose of the project. Okay, in this case, to make the conditional in Hebrew, you take the verb to be, lihiyot, you conjugate it for the past tense, and then you add to it the present tense. I'm going to write this out here so you understand how this works. Okay. Oop. See if it'll let me do this. There we go. Okay, what I'm doing is past tense of to be plus present tense of modified verb. Okay, Simple as that. Let me just make sure that you can see that. There we go. Okay, so what do I mean? Hayiti is I was or I were. In this case, I would. It is the past tense first person singular of lihiot. Lihiot means to be. Hayiti, I was, or I would in this case. Okay? Kotev is the present tense we talked about up here, right? Ani kotev. So it's not ani kotev like we had here in row 4, right? I write or I am writing. It's hayiti kotev. I would write. Okay, that's a very different expression. Instead of saying I write or I am writing, I would write, right? It means that something else has to happen for me to write. The conditional. And how do we do it? Again, we conjugate the verb to be in the past tense based on who's speaking or who's the subject, and then followed by the present tense of the verb we want them to do. Hayiti kotev, hayiti yotze ha'erev, I would go out tonight. Hayiti mivashel ochel ha'erev, I would cook tonight. Im yelizman, if I will have time. Okay, that's what the conditional means. We use it in Hebrew just like you do in English. I would write if I knew the condition, if I knew the purpose of the project. Very important to understand. This doesn't have its own conjugation. Rather, it uses a couple verbs in very specific tenses to make that happen. Okay, so conditional, past tense of to be, plus the present tense of the verb that you're using. And the second one here is the subjunctive. Subjunctive is also important. This is one that we rarely hear about in English. We have it, we just don't have its own conjugation. And therefore we don't often learn about what subjunctive means. Whereas if you're learning another language, I remember learning Spanish and all the different contexts of learning subjunctive. So after you finish learning 12 different conjugations, 12 different tenses, then you're like, okay, now we're gonna flip it all around. Now you gotta learn the subjunctive. And you're just like, what is that? Subjunctive, think emotions. Think wishing, think doubting, think hoping, think anything like that is subjunctive. Here's a great example of the subjunctive in Hebrew and how we create it. Esmach shetichtavi li od hayom. Row 10 here. Esmach shetichtavi li od hayom. I would appreciate, or I'd love, or I'd be happy that you'd write me today, or by today's end. Okay? Esmach she. Esmach comes from the verb lismoach, to be happy or to become happy. Ani esmach, I will be happy, and also I would be happy, or I'd love, or I'd appreciate. Okay, and then it's followed by she, can also be followed by the word im with an aleph, meaning if. Tichtavi. Okay, so what do we have here? We have in the subjunctive, when you're wishing something, or hoping for something, or anytime you're expressing emotion in that respect, you're going to use future tense of helping verb plus future tense of verb object. Let me make that a little bit clearer for you. Subject. And then, sorry, just want to make sure that you can see that and then explain that a little bit more clearly. Okay, what do I mean here? Future tense of the helping verb, i.e. subject, future tense of the verb, i.e. object. Esmach, I will be happy, I will love, I will appreciate. I have become the subject of this sentence. Okay, the very first verb is conjugated for me. Ani asmach. Asmach followed by she or im. Tichtevi li, that you feminine would write or will write to me by today or by today's end. Od hayom means in the course of today. Okay, still in the course of today, by today's end is another way to think about it. But the point is, look how it's conjugated. Ani asmach, first person. She tichtevi, that you will, right? So it's using two verbs right next to each other. And it's combined in a way that's showing hope or a wish. Okay, ani asmach, first person, she tichtevi, second person. Very important how we use subjunctive. Again, you're not going to use this all the time, just like with conditional. You're not going to use these all the time. But number one, we do use these on a regular basis in Hebrew, especially the using phrases beginning with esmach. I'd be happy if or that. We use all the time, or I'd love. This is how you say, I would love for you to do something in Hebrew, ani asmach. Okay, and the second reason this is important is that these two do not have their own unique conjugation forms. You have to combine verbs together in specific tenses to create them. And when we use them on a regular basis, that's important to keep in mind. Okay, while we're on the subject of combining verbs, I want to talk about auxiliary verbs, or simply put, helping verbs. Helping verbs, we know these from English, right? To be, to do, to have. That's like we said before. I am writing, right? I have eaten today. I have eaten twice today. Do you need to speak to someone? Okay, all of those verbs are called helping verbs. They attach to another verb to further illustrate the action. In Hebrew, we have them. We don't have the exact same ones we have in English, and we have some extra ones too. So let's start with one we've already talked about. Haiti kotev. Haiti kotev, we talked about, could mean I would write. It can also mean I was writing. Okay, I said before, katavti simply means I wrote in the past tense. If you want to have it keep going, the exact term for this in grammar is the imperfect tense, right? I was writing. You could say haiti kotev. Again, past tense of the verb to be, followed by the present tense of the verb that's being modified. Okay, that's one way that we have these helping verbs, is the verb lihiot, to be. The second verb that we use a lot is yachol. Yachol is a irregular verb in many ways, but we use it a lot. Yachol can mean can or able to. Yacholti lichtov lecha. I could write to you. Right? Yacholti lichtov lecha. Row 13 here. Yacholti lichtov lecha. I could write to you, masculine. Okay, lecha is masculine. Yacholti lichtov lecha. Ani yachol lichtov sefer. I can write a book. I don't mean that right now. Or ani yuchal lichtov sefer. I will be able to write a book. Okay, this is a verb that we use quite a lot in Hebrew, yachol. Yachol in present, future, and past, we use quite a lot after lihiot. Another verb we use, just like in English, just like in other languages, is the verb to go, lalechet. Ani holech lichtov lecha. Right? I'm going to write to you. Right? Just like in English, it doesn't mean I'm physically walking to write to you. It means I'm going to write to you. I'm about to start writing to you at some point in the near future. It's going to happen sometime soon. Ani holech lichtov lecha. We use this verb all the time in modern Hebrew. This is a really important construct to remember. Holech, and it gets conjugated based on who the speaker is, who the subject is, followed by the infinitive. Ani holech lichtov lecha. At holechet la'avod hayom. You are going to work today. אנחנו הולכים לתכנן לחופשה. We're going to plan for a vacation. Okay, anytime it's something hasn't started yet, it's not in the future, it's in the near future, we're going to use this verb lalechet in the present tense, followed by the infinitive. Very important one, row 14. The other one you're going to hear much more often in Israel is using the verb la'amod. La'amod means to stand, right? And we use this verb the same way as lalechet, meaning something is imminently about to happen. Ani omed lichtov lecha is the equivalent of saying, I'm just about to write to you, or as I wrote here in very formal English, I'm going to write to you imminently. It literally means stand, right? I'm standing to write to you, or I'm standing to go to the supermarket. Ani omed lalechet lasuper, right? Anything like that, omed and holech are going to be used to indicate you're doing something in the very near future. Like the moment you finish the sentence to a few minutes from now. It can be a little bit longer than that, but the point is it's very imminent. Holech and omed followed by the infinitive. Okay, 4 really important helper verbs that we use all the time in Hebrew. And notice how they're used in conjugation. Some are conjugated, some are using just the infinitive. So you get away with that, not having to conjugate. A great thing, right? Another final point when it comes to tenses and these helper verbs. In Hebrew, we don't have the equivalent of to have and to do. We do have a verb meaning to do, la'asot, but it doesn't get used in the same way that we use it in English of, do you have to go today? Does this make sense? Right? That is the verb to do as the helper verb in English. It does not work like that in Hebrew. Likewise, the verb to have, we do not have in the Hebrew. It does not exist. I have been to the supermarket. You can't say that. You can't translate that literally into Hebrew. You could say, Hayiti kvar bamakolet. I was already in the grocery store. Right? If you want to indicate that something has completed. I have been to the supermarket. It just doesn't exist in Hebrew. That to have something in the context of what's called in grammar the perfect tense. Sorry, not sorry, it doesn't exist. But we do have these other great helper verbs, and we have a modest amount of our own tenses here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Not bad. Really not bad. Okay. So going back to our, put this back into full screen. Going back to our 4 points, right at the top. Gender, tense, active, passive, binyan. We've talked about gender. Everything has gender. Tense, we just went through quite a lot. Active, passive, and binyan. I talked a little bit about active and passive. Let's get to binyan. Binyan is a unique function of Hebrew, a unique function of Semitic languages. We've talked about this before when we talked about passive language. This is taken from the Wikipedia article on modern Hebrew verbs. I highly, highly recommend all of you to read this on Wikipedia called Modern Hebrew Verbs. Just type it into Wikipedia. That's all you need to do. It is a great grammatical lesson in everything you need to know about verbs. It's probably going to be a little overwhelming, but it has this great graphic. This graphic explains what the binyan is. We've talked about binyans before, right? Where Hebrew, words in Hebrew are comprised of 2 things, a shoresh and a mishkal. A mishkal is what we use for nouns and adjectives. It gives further meaning to a shoresh. As you see here, the root in this case is pe ayin lamed. Pe ayin lamed is another verb that means to do or to act. It also is where we get the word for verb in Hebrew, pual, and all the things related to activities and things like that. Lif'ol is to act, right? As in to work something, not as in to act on a stage, right? So all Hebrew words have a combination of shoresh, root, and a mishkal if it's a noun, and a binyan if it's a verb. And what's so amazing about this system is that the shoresh, those three letters, have their own general meaning, and the mishkal and the binyan have their own general meanings, right? When we plug it into specific forms, they have their own meanings. So when you put these two together, you come up with the word, right? So this times this, shoresh times a binyan, because we're talking about verbs, equals a conjugated verb. Simple as that. And what you have here in modern Hebrew are 7 of these binyanim. Each of these binyanim have a general meaning. Some of these are going to be relevant to a shoresh more than others, but this is the general look of it. And it's shaped like a menorah, so it's nice and easy to remember. I'm talking about Hebrew. We'll start at the outer edge. The outer edge, as you see at the bottom of the graphic, is called simple, right? Simple, it's known as Pual, and Pual is considered the most basic form of a shoresh in a verb, right? Think lichtov. We're going to get to this verb in a little bit. That's what we're talking about here. And you notice this is a menorah, so the branches go both ways. And we talked about active and passive. Each of these forms that have an active form, active binyan, have a passive form. So active is Pual, its passive form is nif'al. Okay. PL is the next one. It's often called the intensive one. Its active is PL. Its passive is called Pual. Hif'il is the causative, to cause something to happen. Its passive is Huf'al. And then we have in the middle reflexive. It's also reciprocal, called Hitpa'el. What do all these refer to? These are all referring to the past tense, third person, singular conjugation of that verb. What do I mean by that? We've talked about this many times before, that the default in Hebrew is male. Well, the default when you're looking up verbs in a dictionary like this one is going to be the form of the verb in that binyan with the right shoresh. So let's say I was looking up the verb lichtov, right? Lichtov, I know because I've learned it. Lichtov is the infinitive form of Pual. And so therefore its default form, its third person singular form, he wrote, is hu katav, right? So if I want to find out katav, I'd look in this dictionary, as most dictionaries. I would look up katav, kaf tav vet. Let me look it up right now. We're getting there. There it is. Katav. Katav is all the way down here. It starts down here. You can see that. Katav. Okay, katav. And it says katav. It has a pay next to it, meaning poal. And then it says in English, wrote. Okay, then it has a definition of the word in Hebrew. So it's a really good way to learn further Hebrew. And it gives me a sample sentence. And then it shows me its conjugation here, right? You can see that way at the top. It says here, lichtov kaf tav vet is the shoresh, and it's emphasized, it has periods in between the letters. And then it's followed by the word pa'al. So it's clear this verb, katav, is in the Pual binyan, and its shoresh is kaf tav vet, and it even gives me starting to conjugate it. Katav tikotev yichtov tov. Really good dictionary. We're going to go through some of that together in a little bit. But just know, all Hebrew verbs fall in one of these 7 binyanim. All of them. Without exception, all 7 of these. What I will tell you is, once you understand how these work, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't in terms of the meaning. But once you start understanding the conjugation of these, with very few exceptions, is always the same. It's not going to be like English, where you have to sit there and memorize all the irregular verbs. The amount of irregular verbs in Hebrew you can hold in one, maybe 1.5 hands. It doesn't exist as they do in other languages. There are some exceptions to the rule, and even those have rules. And so you understand how they work. But all Hebrew verbs fall into one of these 7 forms, these binyanim. And these forms dictate how they're conjugated and their general meaning. So let's go over to a little bit of an example. And we're going to use our friend lichtov again, because lichtov happens to work for the vast majority of our 7 binyanim. And this is how it works. Again, we're going to use the past tense, third person singular. He wrote. Okay, again, that's how it's going to show in dictionaries if you were to look up these words. Pa'al, like we said, hu katav, he wrote, is pa'al, means the basic form of this meaning, right? Whenever you see a word that has the shoresh of kaf, tav, vet, you know it has something to do with writing. It can be a noun, it can be an adjective, it can be a verb. It's going to have to do something with writing, 100%. These binyanim are going to dictate further description of what exactly the action is, right? Because there's more to it than just writing, as you're going to find out. The passive of pa, like I said, is nif'al. And it's nif'al because look how it's written here. Nichtav, the same vowels, and it begins with the letter nun. Nichtav, nif'al. Right, just like katav, pa'al. The vowel pattern in the names of these binyanim tell you what the structure is going to be. Katav, pa'al. Nichtav, nif'al. Okay, in this case, it, masculine, was written. The book was written. Hasefer nichtav lifnei shana. The book was written a year ago. Hasefer nichtav lifnei shana versus Ani katavti et hasefer lifnei shana versus I wrote the book a year ago. Right? One is passive, one is active. Like I said, Hebrew loves passive when it's appropriate, when you can use it and it makes sense. Okay, so that's pa'al and nif'al. These two go together, right? Because one is the passive form of the active or the active form of the passive, however you want to see it. Then we come to PL and Pual. PL and Pual are really important for a couple reasons, not for this specific shoresh. This does actually have a form in PL. We don't use this very often. Lechatev, in this case, kitev, he addressed. We don't use it very often. But PL is often used the most when we are creating new words and new verbs. For example, we've talked about this before with slang, right? We've talked about lefasbek, to add someone or to friend someone on Facebook. Lefasbek. Lefasbek is in the PL form. Ani fisbakti oto. Hu fisbek oti. It's using the exact same form. Hu fisbek, hu kitev, PL. Many of the verbs that we use, that we've created recently in Hebrew, are in the PL form. I think the reason for that, don't quote me on this, I think the reason for that is because this form has the least amount of exceptions. When there are certain radicals in the root, there are certain letters that affect the vowel sounds and the helper letters around it. PL has the least amount. And PL has a much easier vowel pattern to it, right? It's the verb to speak, lidaber. Lidaber is PL. Diber, hu diber, hu diber, he spoke in the past. Lidaber, midaber, edaber, and so forth. It's a very easy one to speak because every letter, has a vowel under it. So it's a lot easier to add new words to it, new cognates. So lifasbek, to Facebook someone. Lifaxes, a very old one but relevant one, unfortunately still in Israel, to fax something. Lisames, to send an SMS, or more recently, liWhatsApp, to send someone a WhatsApp. All of these are PL because PL allows a lot more fluidity because of its vowel structure. Okay, PL also has its own passive form, like we saw in that menorah, Pual. Okay, kitev, kutav. Again, this is a verb I put in italics specifically because even though there is a definition for the verb kitev and lichatev, we rarely use it. So it's in italics just to know that it does exist. We just don't use it. I'm using it here only as a placeholder so you can understand PL and Pual. Okay. Hif'il and hufal. This one we definitely have. Again, hif'il and hufal, like it's written here, are causative, right? So if a verb is in the hif'il form, it means it's a causative form. Okay, so I took the root kaf tav bet, which means write, something about writing. I put it in this form. What does causative writing mean? To cause someone to write something. Okay, what does that, how do we say that in better English? To cause someone or something to write? To dictate. Hichtiv, he dictated. Not as in dictated as a dictator, but dictated he dictated his speech to the reporter. He dictated his ideas to his secretary. That's what this means. He caused something or someone to write. That's what causative means. Okay. Excuse me. So hichtiv, he dictated. Huchtav, the passive form, it was dictated. It, meaning it was masculine because it's huchtav, was dictated. Okay, it was dictated. The speech was dictated. Haneum huchtav, the speech was dictated. And then finally, hitpael, the seventh form. The seventh form is often taught as reflexive or reciprocal. I often will translate it or think of it also as to get or become something. In this case, it is reciprocal. Hitkatev, to correspond, he corresponded, to write to one another, right? It's the reciprocal form. Reciprocal means what I do, you do back, or vice versa. But the point is, it goes back and forth. Hu hitkatev, he corresponded. Okay, the idea of correspondence obviously meaning there's more than one person involved in it. Okay, so all 7 of these, 6 of these, 3 of these have their own passive form. The one at the end, reciprocal, reflexive, reciprocal, are also to get or become. Now, I'm going to pause here before I take your questions because I kept talking about this website. If this didn't make any sense to you, that's fine. It's grammar, it's verbs, it's a little scary, that's fine. This is why I kept hyping this website I wanted to show you. And let me make sure that it's open before we get to it. We've talked about it before. I'm going to show it to you again. We're actually going to go through it together because it's that important of a resource to have out there. Is pealim.com. Look at the top. Don't ask me the URL. It's up there at the top. pealim.com. This is your new friend. This will help you understand Hebrew conjugation incredibly well. This is the About section, and it shows just how powerful this website is. Here you can see full conjugations of verbs, and we're going to do that with lichtov in a second. Find the verb forms you need. So let's say, as opposed to an old dictionary where you have to look up the past tense third person singular of a verb to find out its meaning and all of its conjugation, this, you can just type it in, right? Dictionary, also really good. And if you want to get even more complicated, and this part I really love, is use our constructor. Here, I'm going to start with this because this part is a little bit more complicated, more advanced, but I think this is a lot of fun. Use our constructor. Look at this. So first off, it comes with a keyboard. You don't have to worry about having a dual language keyboard or anything like that. It has an online one. You put in your root. Any root you want. Let's say I'm going to put in I'm going to put in the root shin mem shin. Okay, shin mem shin. Shin mem shin has to do with using, utility, and what I'm going to do here once I put it in here, and then you see on the left, on the right, excuse me, it says binyan, and we're going to pick one of those 7 binyanim to see, does it exist in any of these other ones? I know it exists in a couple of these, so I'm going to pick one, PL. Now it gives me even more options. We're not going to go through all those together. They're far too advanced for the little time we have left. C inflection. I'm going to click on it, and now it gives me the conjugation of lishamesh. It gives me the binyan, which I picked, PL. It gives me the root, shin mem shin, and tells me this root does not have any special conjugation properties. It means there's no exceptions. It works like it's supposed to. And it gives me all the conjugations here of it, right? Present tense participles, past tense, first, second, and third person, masculine and feminine, singular and plural, future tense, imperative, infinitive. See in the dictionary every other time this root comes up. It is such an incredible resource to have. Lishamesh at the end is the verb that we have, to be used or to serve, right? You've probably heard of the verb lehishtamesh, to use. Gives you all the different forms that this root takes place, both not just in nouns, in verbs rather, but in nouns. Absolutely amazing. So let's say we go to the top. Again, there's a virtual keyboard up there. I type in lichtov, our go-to verb for today, right? Results for lichtov. I get lichtov, root, kaf, tav, vet, see here in the middle, part of speech, pa'al. All the things we knew about before. Lichtov, it even tells you, gives you the transliteration and the vowels, the nikud, the dots and bars that indicate vowel sounds. And on the right, it tells you notes, infinitive form, to write. View full conjugation. And again, this root does not have any special conjugation properties, meaning there's no exceptions, no irregularities, meaning to write. And now it gives me everything here, and it gives me the verb full nikud, so the dots and bars indicating vowels, transliteration, and it gives me even the English. Folks, this is an incredible website, pe'alim.com. Look it up, spend as much time as you want on this. You can also type words in English and find their meanings as well. It will give you the entire conjugation at a click. All the conjugation. I promise it is not as difficult as it seems. This is a great resource, but it's the point to show you that when you remember those 4 things to keep in mind, you will learn the pattern. You will learn the pattern of how verbs conjugate. It is not as daunting as it is. And worst case scenario, you have an amazing resource in this form of this website for you. Okay, I see we have a bunch in the Q&A. I want to get to as many of them as I can. Anonymous asks, is ktov stronger than tichtov? Great question. Let me open up my screen again so you can see that. Sorry, just 1 second. Okay, so with the command form, we've talked about this before, with the imperative rather. In Hebrew, we have 2 different forms of the command, of the imperative. Ktov, the actual imperative, and tichtov, the future tense that we use as the command. Ktov is always going to be the more aggressive, the more commanding form, or however it's conjugated here. Daber, speak, anything like that. It's the reason why not all verbs use this. And it's the reason why when you're speaking in everyday Hebrew, you're not going to hear it as often as the future tense. It's very commanding. It's not that Israelis can't be commanding or be bossy. It's just it's a little too aggressive. Again, even for stereotypical Israelis. So Ktov is quite aggressive. It's a great question. You aren't going to hear it as often. There are certain verbs that take it more than others. You're going to learn it by just using them, but just know it is more aggressive and it's stronger for sure. I see a bunch of people asking again for the dictionary, so let me hold it up again so you can write it down. You can also screenshot this. You can also get the recording of this in the next few days. So you can also come back to it, but it's Multi-Dictionary by Lauder and Weinbach with the English, I believe. Yes, the English by Miriam Shani. Okay, and it looks like this. Hopefully not as well weathered as mine. Okay. Ellen asks, for conditional conjugation, do you conjugate Haiti and Kotev to match gender and singular plural? Yes, Ellen, as you saw, Haiti Kotev, I would write. Both of these refer to me. There's only one person who's acting so far in that situation. Haiti Kotev, I would write. So we're using Haiti, I would, Kotev, write. Okay, Haiti, past tense, I. Kotev, present tense, I. Great question. For future conjugations, first person is ani optional. Absolutely. Like I said before at the beginning, echtov can't be confused for anything else. Echtov will always be I will write. You can say ani echtov, you don't have to. You can simply say echtov. Okay. Zoom user, or that's just the name they go by. I realize we're running out of time, but I want to answer some of these questions. Yeshli, I thought, means I have. Not in this instance. Great question. Yeshli means I have, but that's not what I'm talking about in a helper verb. I have to go to the store. I have been to the store. I will have gone to the store. All of those instances of have is not the same thing as yeshli. Yeshli literally means there is to me. It's the way that we create expression because we don't have the verb to have in Hebrew. Okay, so yeshli is important, absolutely. Yeshli pelefon. Yeshli mala sot ha'erev. I have stuff to do this evening. I have a phone. That's it though, right? You can hear in those sentences, it ends at the possession. Once you articulate what you possess, it has nothing to do with the verb to have been, to have gone, to have written, to have spoken, to have eaten. That's not the same form of the verb to have as yeshli. Great question, important question. Okay. David asks, someone asked me before, you explained that Haiti Ose would be imperfect, but wouldn't it be conditional? Great question. Haiti Ose, do I have to take care on the context, or is it Hebrew imperfect the same as the conditional? No, great question, David. Haiti Ose, that's not enough of a sentence. Haiti Ose could be both the conditional, like we said. I would do something. Haiti Ose, I would do something. Or I was doing something. Haitio says some, and then context is important in Hebrew. Haitio says not enough of enough context to explain what tense we're talking about. It could be both. Great question, Jackie and Marty. Please discuss when to use the past participle versus when to use the passive form. If nifal is, it was written, great question. So if you look at the modern Hebrew verbs, they use this exact point to talk about the difference between the past tense, the passive tense, and the past participle. So we talked about katuv, right? Participle, sefer hakatuv, it's understood that the book has been done for a while. A sefer nichtav, the book could have been done half a second ago, the moment I spoke that it was nichtav. Katuv understood it has been completely done, over and done with. It's a subtle difference, but an important one. The major distinction between past participle here and the passive tense is that past participle can also be used as a noun and an adjective in addition to a verb. So you have much more flexibility here than you do as just a verb, as a passive. But that's a great question. Again, highly recommend reading that article on modern Hebrew verbs to further explain that. Zoe, what if you put in the wrong pa'al with a root verb, but it isn't pa'al? Again, if you put in What did I show? Let me show again that website because it's just that powerful. Sorry, I'm just reading the other questions to see if I can answer everything off the other site. Let me just open that up. There it is. Okay. Let me share that. Sorry, just 1 second, folks. Okay, what if I don't know the binyan? What if I come across a word, and this happens quite a lot, where let's say, or I'm just given a shoresh, or for example, I saw someone give the example of yud, shin, bet. I have no idea what to do with this verb. Okay. When I put it in yud, shin, bet, I get a couple options. Now I get lashevet, to sit or to settle, and liyashev, to settle, to inhabit, to settle, to resolve a dispute. I also get linshov, which is actually nun shin bet, but it's adding it in here because in certain forms it conjugates very similarly. As you see here, yishov is he will blow or it will blow, as in the wind or the machine or whatever it may be. But lashevet and leyashev, right? One is pa'al, one is pl. But just by putting in the verb here, I get an understanding of all its different forms here. And it also gives me the infinitives on the left, but it also gives me all the different forms that could be spelled as close to yud, shin, bet as possible. So yashav, yeshev, right? Yashav is it sat. Yeshev, he will sat. Yashev, settle. Yishev, he settled or it settled. Yushav, it will be settled. It was settled, rather. It's the Pual. So this gives you, if you don't know the binyanim yet, and that's fine. From what I hear from the ulpanim, it's often not even taught. You don't need to worry about it. You need to understand they exist. They have their own general meanings, and they give you further insight into what a word means. And this website will help you even more break down what those different options are. Sorry, just okay. Last question. Yes, Zoe also asks, in past conjugation, Pa'al, how would you know how to conjugate in certain cases? Well, Cs. Again, use the website. There are ways to remember how to do what's called Gizrat Lamed Hey, right? It's even in this dictionary, Gizrat Lamed Hey. All you have to do is type in Ro'eh into that very powerful website. Let's actually do it right now. She asked about the verb sees. So let's type it in. Ro'eh, lir'ot, to see, right? I click on this, I get all of the forms to do it. Okay, the farther you get involved in Hebrew, you'll learn the forms. You'll understand what Gizrat Lamed Hey is. I don't want to go into that now because that's not everyday Hebrew. Talking about grammar. What is the verb lir'ot, right? So if you want to know how to use the verb lir'ot, here is the full conjugation table. And you can memorize this, but you'll also pick up the patterns in how it's conjugated. Okay, so again, this wasn't a class about how to recognize the conjugation tables. We could do that in a future class if you want to, where I sit there and we go, ani katavti, ata katavta, at katavt, hu katav, he katva. I think that's a waste of both of our time. What is important is to crack the code behind what's going on here. What are the 4 different things we need to take into account when we're doing this, when we're finding different words, and how do we use resources like pealim.com, like our dictionaries, to further understand, but to just understand the basics of a verb before we get into the nitty gritty of how is this conjugated? Well, wait a minute, it sounds like something. No. Take a deep breath, take a step back, remember those 4 things. You'll be really good for verbs. Okay, with that, we need to stop. We are 10 minutes over. Toda rabah, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining. We'll see you all next week after Purim. In the meantime, as we are a few days before Purim, wishing you all a Purim Sameach or Chag Purim Sameach. Either one is what we say here in Israel in modern Hebrew to wish each other a happy Purim. May you all have a Purim Sameach. See you all soon. Take care. Litraot.